open source, despite its name, isn't necessarily free. You've been around a few generations of open source companies, from Elastic to ClickHouse now. How do you think about balancing community versus commercialization in that journey?
I mean, surprisingly, my journey with open source started at Sun Microsystems in 1997 when I was an intern working on the Java station. So it's been a while. It's an incredible model in terms of technology innovation and in terms of distribution, but it's obviously very challenging. And you could tell that by the very few companies who have been able to build a sustainable, independent business around an open source project. You can count them really on one hand. In the public markets, you've got Mongo, Confluent, and Elastic. In the private markets, you've got Databricks. And then you have the acquisitions of HashiCorp and the acquisitions of Red Hat. So it all starts with the community. If you don't have a vibrant community that you invest in and that you foster and that you collaborate with, then advancing the technology and trying to build a successful business model around it is nearly impossible.
And you were at Elastic probably during one of its most critical moments when it went through the license change from open source license to a more proprietary license. Talk us through that decision.
I'll probably broaden my answer just to open source licensing more generally. It's very tricky because, well, first off, the religious war around open source licensing has evolved significantly over the past decade. It used to be Apache versus AGPL, and there were pros and cons to each. And now it's evolved because you have all these derivative licenses that people are adopting. And the reasons they do so are obvious in terms of limiting competition, of taking an open source project and offering it as a managed service. But when you do that, obviously it comes with a trade-off. And so ClickHouse, for example, we still govern the project under an Apache 2 license, which means it's extraordinarily permissive. And we see that really aid in popularity and adoption. But we're probably one of the few last remaining popular open source databases who have not changed the license. And that's very intentional. And obviously it's something that we take very seriously and we discuss. And we also bring in members of the community to talk about the pros and cons of implementing a license change. And if you were to do so, what's the right time to do that?
As you think about product development in that context, how do you think about the features or functionality that you release on your cloud product versus then releasing into the open source community or the broader sort of open source project?
And that's a great question. So, our business model is oriented around a managed service that we call ClickHouse Cloud. Now, other companies can use ClickHouse and offer it as a managed service. They're perfectly entitled to do that based off this very permissive license that governs the open source project. And so if you're going to build a managed service, you need to differentiate yourself somehow. And the only way to do that is to develop a proprietary feature set that you do not release back into the open source. And by doing so, that comes with the risk that you're going to get some blowback from the community. That historically they've had this extremely feature-rich database with this monthly release cycle that Alexei and his team have been delivering. And now all of a sudden, some of the more perceived valuable features are not going to be accessible to them because the company behind the project chooses to keep those as proprietary offerings. It's a balancing act. So nearly every feature that we develop, we have the discussion and debate internally. Will this be something that we release back into the open source? And it's not a point in time question. It can be, this is going to be a feature that we offer in our managed service to help fuel the growth of the company and to make our customers successful. And then eventually we may take that feature and release it back into the open source. So it's not just a one-way street or a point in time decision.
How do you think about, how have you had to balance sort of growth versus profitability across the different macro backdrops that you've had to execute through?
Well, we are obviously losing money because we're investing heavily in the future and developing this differentiated cloud product. Fortunately, our customers are deriving great value from it. So we're migrating workloads from alternative cloud data warehouse solutions or transactional databases, or users of our open source are moving to our cloud product, and they are giving us feedback that it's significantly less expensive and is more performant in terms of query latency. And so the customer feedback has been a great validation of this. Fortunately, we're very well capitalized, so we can afford to forward invest. That obviously won't always be the case. We need to demonstrate operating efficiency, we need to demonstrate margin expansion, and we need to demonstrate a path to being not profitable in the next few years, but cash flow break even, where then we'll really control the destiny of the company and we won't rely upon outside investment to fuel this growth.
Yeah. I know ClickHouse is, in the most generous sense, a remote company. Obviously, there's been a lot of pressure to build sort of centers of excellence, come back to office and bring people together. How do you think about being remote first with the rest of the industry sort of moving back to office?
Well, I've seen both models. At Salesforce, it was very office-centric. I was in the office 5 days a week. The closer you were to Mark Benioff, the higher the rank was in the company. And then at Elastic, it was a very distributed company. We had some office space, but a lot of people worked virtually. ClickHouse was born during COVID. And so out of necessity, we were a distributed company and remote first. And also with the European roots of the team and the technology, we were going to be distributed on day one. And fast forward 3.5 years later, I think there's significant advantages to that in terms of the employees you're able to hire and recruit, and then the international mix of your customer base. Like right now, over half of our business comes from outside of the United States. So we've got this kind of unfair advantage in terms of internationalization at such an early stage. But I do think it comes at a cost in terms of collaboration and teamwork and problem solving. But I think the pros outweigh the cons. And I think companies like ours will gradually start to introduce an office setting for employees that are in centrally located hubs. People in the Bay Area, New York, Denver, for example, London. We have an office in Amsterdam, have expressed a desire to get together in person increasingly over the last year.
And how have you gone about thinking about building culture in this distributed sort of office setting?
Over communicate and be wildly transparent so that every employee knows exactly where the company's headed. They know the strategy for the next few years. They understand who is going to execute on what tasks, how we're going to communicate internally. We've identified operating metrics that we expose to the entire company in this wildly transparent way. So every individual in the company knows exactly who our top customers are, who the top prospects are, how much money we're spending in certain areas over others. So in many respects, our employees are getting an MBA in terms of how to build a company while at the same time authoring this incredible software.